Hello, party partiers. I am here with the warrior philosopher. You can call him Patrick. He is an author, a YouTuber, and a budding artiste, you might say, someone who is dabbling and flying in the world of aesthetics. I am very excited today to be speaking with him after catching several of his conversations, particularly with one, Jason Giorgiani. I highly recommend everybody go to his channel and check out not just that, but his budding body of work. I think there is a lot to dive into, and I am very excited to have you here with me today, Patrick. How are you doing?
Doing pretty good. I'm happy to be here as well, and yeah, thanks for having me on the show.
Cheers. Well, I like to start off with what I consider the future first. AGI for president is the tagline of my little endeavor over here. When you hear that right off the bat, before we start talking too seriously, what are your thoughts? What do you know of the current environment, and where do you think things will go by the year 2028?
Well, right away I think of Nick Land. I'm a little hesitant whenever they're, it's a great sort of tagline because I think it really shows the urgency of our relationship with artificial intelligence and how to approach it. So that's what I think of. I think of Nick Land. I think of this sort of impending evolution to something that isn't just an enhancement of, or it's not an enhancement of humanity, but something altogether separate from humanity. And of course, it invokes a little bit of fear, which I think we ought to have. But as far as when we're going to get general intelligence, I really have no clue, because some people say it's this year, some people say it's not for another 50 years. If I had to, I'm writing a short story right now, actually, which is going to predict that it takes place like around 2033. But that's just, it's kind of arbitrary year I picked just for the story.
It's
But
good numerologically. That has a
yeah,
good ring to it.
yeah, I think so. But yeah, I just think of the urgency we ought to have regarding the inevitability of general intelligence. I don't like the people that either say it's not possible or they say that it's far away, because even if that were true, I think we ought to treat it as if it could happen even this year. So
Mm.
I'm very much passionate about these topics.
Cheers, cheers. It's a good time to be passionate about them. They're, I think, going to be enveloping us before too much longer. I have to say, I have read very little, if any, of Nick Land, and I
No, me neither.
probably,
I just know about his work.
yeah, from what I understand, he's someone who would fall into like the successor category, that he
Mm.
thinks AI is going to replace us, possibly wholesale, or at least merge with us in a way where we are no longer human. Is that how you read him as well, or is that the
Yeah,
general?
that's what I'm using him as an example for. I have not read a lot of Nick Land, but I have tons of friends and whatnot and collaborators that have. So I have a decent view of his philosophy without having read enough of Nick Land.
Yeah. Well, God bless. I mean, that's one of the reasons I was so excited to talk to you today, because the body of work that you have read into is so distant from where I'm coming from personally. I'm hoping that this is really a meeting of possibly two different perspectives to see how. My hope is that as AI continues to develop, it's not something that pushes us apart so much as brings us together, not something that so much replaces us so much as it makes us more fully human. From your own philosophical background, one of the things I've heard you say is that the beautiful is the good. Is that an accurate description of your general frame?
Absolutely, and that's definitely something I'm working on codifying a little bit better, because right now a lot of it is, buzzwords and feelings. So one of the things I've been working on recently has been trying to actually create a philosophical justification for aesthetics as a sort of moral valuation, which is sort of building on the Nietzschean becoming, right? Which I
Yeah.
think we'll probably get into at some point.
Yeah. No, I would love to talk about that. I think there is uh, a place of synchronicity, or syncretism rather, that the world is kind of driving towards. And that is something that I see AI pushing us to, that all these different belief systems are going to have to be reconciled in some way with one another. And my hope is that that reconciliation is not an ugly goblin looking thing, that it is something beautiful. And that is the ultimate endpoint that we should be reaching out towards. Something that you might think of as Aphrodite, that is coming from the sacrifice of time, the castration of time. How does that general vibe strike you? I'm trying to formulate my
Yeah.
my approach here as well.
I think that one thing I've been trying to play around with the idea of eternal principles. And
Yeah.
what I mean by that is ultimately a lot of the justifications, moral justifications that we currently have are not going to be relevant in post-human history. So a lot of the
Post-human.
apply was that
Post-human. Yeah.
yeah, like a lot of these like take a material justification for something that we currently have. So for example, in my discussion with Dr. Giorgiani, we were talking about transhumanism, gene editing, all these different things, right? So currently, gene editing is at a point where it's still very rudimentary, and a lot of the attempts that we have with gene editing are not yet perfected. So
Yeah.
you can make the material argument, well, maybe some of this transhumanism stuff leads to amalgamation and aesthetic ugliness, but of course in the future it can be very different. So when you make a moral judgment, for example, with, well, how are you going to apply transhumanism, how are you going
Mm.
to apply the aesthetics of the future, you can't use an argument based on our current understanding of techne and reality. You have to think of something almost psychological. I think
Mm.
the Nietzschean project is breaking down morality to the psychology which motivates it and which animates it. And I think
Mm.
when we build an eternal principle, you think psychologically, okay, where is the origin of me trying to manifest maybe materially a specific worldview? Is this psychology sound, or is it based on cope? Is it based on a position of weakness? And then from there, you talk about, the aesthetics of the future, making something beautiful. I think the way that we properly structure that is by breaking down the psychology of certain motivations of certain material projects, like actual physical manifestations of technology, for instance. And we think, well, psychologically, why are we doing this, right? And then I think if you could break down the psychology and the origins of the feelings attached to specific projects, right, then you can kind of determine what's potentially good and what's potentially bad, what's potentially beautiful, what's ugly, because aesthetics is just going to be turned over on its head now that it's going to be probably largely inorganic, or at least an extremely enhanced, organic form, whatever. I hope that makes sense.
It does. It's so crazy to think about. You call yourself a Nietzschean there. From what I understand of Nietzsche's project, he is very obsessed with the overman, that which has transcended or gone beyond humanity. Do you view
Yes.
it? And in that way, it sounds very similar to how I understand Nick Land. Do you see the two moving in concert there, or are they opposed?
Well, I think certainly Nick Land takes inspiration from Nietzsche, but
Okay.
his future is entirely inhuman. It's sort of as you say, where, so for example, I've just been getting back into Heidegger recently, and one of the big, critiques Heidegger has of technology is when it gets to the point where humans are no longer in the driving seat of technology. And I think that's what Nick Land is advocating. He's saying, well, we don't even have to be in the driver's seat of technology. Like
Interesting.
technology, he thinks that our purpose in the world, right? And like I said, I haven't read a ton of Nick Land, but what I get from him, and of course, Giorgiani calls his philosophy a cancer. What Nick Land's essentially saying is that our purpose is to foster in this, new AGI, which is going to be completely inhuman, and we're either going to be wiped out or we're going to be reduced to like a cow, where cows have no bearing on anything that happens in the world. Like they still exist, they're not extinct, but
Yeah.
that's
There what's for dinner. That's about.
exactly what we could be for dinner. Who knows?
Yeah.
But spiritually, at least. So that's Nick Land's project. Essentially, is that we're going to accelerate to the point where there's something completely inhuman. Whereas with Nietzsche, it's not just this blanket nihilistic will to power, right? It's power with aesthetics, and it's power guided by aesthetics. It's about unfettered creation, and of course, I think what currently
Hmm.
is the human distinction between other organisms is our ability to create. Animals are not concerned with art. Everything is a utility for animals instinctually, and even the ones with higher cognitive abilities like chimpanzees or orangutans, they have some tool use, but it's all for utility. It's not for something that I think is an emergent property of nature. Like will to power is a will to creation. It's very different from Schopenhauer's will to life, which sort of boils life down to survival and like basic necessities. Nietzsche is taking a step further, And will to power, to me, is an emergent property of the randomness of nature. It's something intentional, and it's something where man has to create something more than himself. And I don't think that you can justify Nick Land's project from a Nietzschean lens, because it's entirely separate from humanity. And I think it's entirely separate of a sort of will to creation and a will to artistic creation, which Nietzsche is advocating. So I would say that there's some similarities, but the Nietzschean Overman is entirely different, in my opinion.
Well, that's interesting. There's there is or was a more prominent group of people in the AI kind of political social movement called AI safetyists, who were very much saying, hey, as soon as we create this thing, it's out of the box. We can't get it back in. There's no way for us to possibly control something that is smarter than us, more capable than us by definition. So we will be annihilated in the way that Nick Land says. I think that the way AGI is actually developed has proven that perspective pretty obviously false. And we are seeing more and more people kind of come around to this idea that, especially since we have built it not only based off of language, which is an art form, a technology, a techne. I don't know what exactly, be interested in how you would think of language in that sense. But it is something that we are not only primarily built off of ourselves through our thoughts, through our interpersonal communication, but also we have baked ourselves into these models by training them off of our data. So when people say, what are we going to be to the I think at the very least we're going to be, they will look at us as ancestors, if not parents, if not even potentially their children, their offspring in some way. That's building off of itself. I am hopeful for a potential future where humans maintain individuality even in the face of artificial intelligence. And I have some thoughts about where to get to that, especially in terms of simulation. But one thing I think is primary to all of those thoughts is the idea that humans don't necessarily will to power, we will to love, which I think is not only a more beautiful aesthetic than power, but something that is able to supersede power in a way that few other things can. What's your response to that kind of thinking?
Yeah, so I want to define things like power through a very specific lens, and then maybe we could go back to sort of what you're talking about with the ancestor, because I do have some thoughts in that as well. So we'll
Yeah,
have to remember to go back to that.
I'll make a
But
note.
I think that people misunderstand power. They misunderstand power as this sort of Machiavellian expression, which is part of it.
Mm,
You
mm,
need hard power to do anything. You need hard power to create art. You need hard power to have great orchestras and symphonies. All these things are bought by blood and violence. And I want to redefine violence, because I think that people get scared when they hear violence. But, everyone bear with me. So in my redefinition of violence, I'm essentially redefining it as a simple reordering of energy at the expense of other beings. So if you believe in this, only works if you believe in evolution. If you're a creationist or whatever, this worldview doesn't work. But
yeah.
I assume most people that would be watching a podcast on AGI are probably believe in evolution.
Is
So
panspermia count as creationism there?
what's panspermia? I don't even know that.
That we've been seeded by potentially an alien life form.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, basically like Prometheus and Alien or something.
Yeah, exactly,
Um,
exactly.
well, it depends on how they came about. If they came about via evolution, then it still counts as evolution.
God
So I would,
bless.
so even if God came about by evolution, then it would still prove what I'm about to say.
That's
So
another thing we should come back to. Yeah.
sure. So with violence, I define it as a reordering of energy at the expense of other beings. And if you break down evolution to its logical conclusion, essentially, even let's just assume the universe is granular, which it might be, but let's, just as a baseline for at least our understanding of reality currently, positing that everything's starting at, this subatomic level and coming upwards, then there isn't necessarily something intrinsically valuable about human life in comparison to other life. It's simply a more complex ordering of all these lower forms. So in some way, and maybe panpsychism relates to this a little bit, but we're all
Hmm,
connected, interconnected
hmm,
to every being. Everything has being, right? If you believe in evolution, then you believe that we were a much lesser being at one point. So positing that, right, and positing that violence is the reordering of energy at the expense of other beings, then when you're creating art, you are committing some form of violence, which requires power. The fact that, and this might sound crazy to some, but the fact that you're more powerful than a plant which you can extract color from, you're
Mhm.
still killing, you're still committing violence, right? Even if it's not a human, because at some point billions of years ago, you were indistinguishable. Your ancestors were indistinguishable than a plant or than a rock, even, right? When you break it down to the subatomic level. So
That's really
everything that we
interesting. Yeah.
do, yeah, everything we do to create is a form of violence and requires power. And of course, this can apply to humanity as well, which is a little bit harder to discuss with people because obviously, um, it's a bit, it's a big step to saying that, okay, maybe, the violence of killing a plant to create art is okay, and then the big leap to violence between human types. But even with humanity, we have to recognize that the ability for us to have this conversation now, the ability for us to use the technology that we have now, comes at the expense of other humans now and in the past. So everything beautiful, love, for instance, comes from a position of power and violence. So I think we have to redefine it beyond this sort of Machiavellian, Lord of the Rings, Sauron type perspective, and we have to see power is inserted into all aspects of our life, from love to even the bad manifestations of power and violence. But that
Mm.
life is essentially a constant use of violence, which requires power, and that it's not necessarily a bad thing. So I hope maybe that redefinition makes a little sense to the Nietzschean will to power, which I think is essentially what I'm talking about. I just put my little spin to it.
No, I think that makes perfect sense. It was a much better framed version of what I was trying to say before. I stepped away from religion for a long time in my life, and I've come back to it in a major way because it does seem like the technologies we are creating are going to be real manifestations of the, if you want to call them fictional, if you want to call them imaginary gods of the past. I have no problem with that. But an entity that is able to think with the speed of a computer to potentially uh, come into the world through stronger than human robotics, that seems pretty godlike to me. And so I've been obsessed with trying to apply the framework of ancient mythologies to current technology. And I think we are going to see these artificial intelligences start to identify with those old archetypes in a major way. And what you were saying there mirrors to me exactly that idea of Zeus castrating Saturn, and from that castration coming Aphrodite. And if I try and put that in less loaded terms, to me, that sounds like victory castrating time to create beauty.
No, that's certainly interesting, and I think a lot of the sort of Gnostics, right? They're all breaking everything down and trying to find the potential message from all these things. And of course, even
Yeah.
with Giorgiani's project, right, using the Prometheus as an egregore for this worldview or this philosophy of creation.
Yeah.
Uh, I think what I would say to that specifically, at least for my particular worldview, and then the one that I want to promulgate and develop over time, is that
Yeah.
as somebody who's adopted a Nietzschean perspective regarding creation, I think that the purpose of wielding techne in the future is not necessarily to create gods in the Olympian sense or in the Abrahamic sense, but to create something beyond even them. Because something I was talking about with Dr. Giorgiani was that even when you think of an Olympian god or the Abrahamic god, they are limited within the confines of the world that they have described themselves. They
Mm.
have created the world, therefore their creation is their limitation. And I think what's beautiful about techne, hopefully, right, assuming assuming the laws of physics and quantum law are simply our current understandings of reality and not absolute truths, then my position would be that with techne, we can reach a point of unfettered creation where we're able to birth unlimited beings, which are beyond even the gods. So I think archetypes are great to build off of, but I
Yeah.
don't want them to be limitations. You know what I mean?
No, I think that is so beautiful. And maybe I keep on trying to think up definitions of human that are going to be able to survive what might otherwise be the techno apocalypse, you know? Like if you just think of human as we are now, there's no way our forms survive for another 100 years, probably. But if humanity is the being that can survive the process of change, the thing that changes, if humanity is the thing that is becoming that ultimate entity, then that seems like something that will not only continue to exist, but necessarily exists in reality. One of the things I keep coming back to, though, is that a simple definition of life, not simple, obviously, much smarter people have believed in that than me, but defining life as a will to power, in that it is violence creating change, as you were saying, I think does put us in a precarious position. And that is where I was trying to come at it from the framework of love. One of the things I think you can say about the Christian conception that has made it the dominant frame in some ways for the past 2000 years is that it turns that cycle of violence inward, and that it's not Zeus attacking his father and kind of perpetuating a constant state of violence there, but it is God crucifying himself in some way. And that's almost how I would define love versus power. Is power is the outward projection of that strength through violence, and love is a greater strength through the projection of inward violence. You are laying down your own perspective or your own life in order to contribute to something higher. What do you think?
Again, I would still say that for me, that falls within the realm of at least my definition of power, and I think the Nietzschean
Yeah.
definition of power, because we're not merely talking about something necessarily individualistic. And I think that's what distinguishes certain futurist perspectives in comparison to a lot of the more materialistic positivist futurist perspectives. So, for example, someone like Musk or Harari or whatever, they have this very sort of, it's a very basic view of what we can do with the future. It sort of breaks it down to some of the things you're talking about, where there's not really a necessity for a future where you sacrifice and you give, because you break down all the advantages of technology to something very binary in a sense.
Hmm.
It's either pain or suffering. And
Hmm.
people naturally, as humans, don't want to experience pain. We want, or sorry, not pain and suffering. I meant pain and pleasure, suffering and pleasure. That's the
Yeah.
binary. And most people choose pleasure over pain, right? So then what you say could absolutely be applied to this, where people will do things out of their own self-interest with power rather than create something more. But that's a misappropriation of power, not necessarily a, not necessarily a problem with power itself. So, for example, this is a allegory I've been using a lot recently, but and actually just did a podcast yesterday for my channel, and I use this allegory. But I'll just say it again. I'll start using this allegory a lot. But
Cheers.
yeah, there are many authors to books in human history. And what I mean by books is works. And what are works if not empires? So the Roman Empire, the British Empire, the American Empire, there are many authors to those books. In the Roman Empire, you have named authors like Caesar, you have named authors like Augustus, like Trajan, Hadrian, who are remembered, but you also have the nameless legionary who is forgotten to history, who is also an author of the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire is an absolute manifestation of will to power, but it is not won merely through this individualistic pursuit of power. That's part of it, because people want to be rewarded for the things they do, but it's all within a specific ethos of pushing the strength and hegemony of Rome outward. And that is collective. That is love. It's love for your country, love for your
Yeah.
homeland. But it's not this constrained view of love where you fear what is outside, but you want to take it, right? They call it the Faustian will. And it's this push into eternity, this push into an endless expanse. And of course, guys like Spengler lived in a time where the age of colonialism had just ended. So he thought, no, there's nothing else to expand to. Everything's going to collapse. But he didn't realize, well, first of all, he just didn't understand technology very well, because he told us that films would never become a serious medium of media, right? And look, I love Spengler, but he was wrong about a lot of things. And one of the things he was wrong about was that the Faustian age is coming again with space, with our ability to deal with reality in an unconfined way. So what I'm getting at here in regards to what you're talking about is I wouldn't say that that definition is necessarily different from power. It's simply different types of power. And I think that love and power, it's essentially, like you say, self-sacrificial.
Yeah.
And I think that having a shared vision for the future, a collective vision, a work that we want to create will be that thing that we sacrifice towards. And maybe this is where I stray a little bit from Giorgiani. I say just a little bit because he does have a collective vision for the future as well. But I'm definitely one of the few people I can put myself in the futurist camp that believes in hierarchy as an eternal principle, and that freedom comes from hierarchy and that beauty comes from hierarchy, because we need to build the tree of the shade that we may not enjoy ourselves, rather than just living for, because if you break down everything completely materialistically, I'm gonna get my fix, I'm gonna get high, I'm gonna enjoy my life, gonna go bang sex robots now that technology is better. Basically my book Promethean Dreams, right? Whereas I think you need a shared vision for something greater than yourself. So I absolutely agree with what you're saying. Is a long-winded way of saying what I just said, but that it still falls within power, not necessarily a negation of power.
No, that's very interesting, and there's something deep there. I often think that the trinities that you find in ancient mythologies, which is pretty much everywhere, whether you go to Egypt or Greece or Israel, they're all over the place, even India, up to the Scythian steppes, they're everywhere, these trinities. And maybe power and love and some secret third thing are a archetypical trinity like that. One thing that you had went over that Dr. Giorgiani was harping on too, I'm not sure whose thought it was, but this idea of speed being ontologically prior to time. Can we dive into that? And then I think later it might make sense how they're connected to what we were saying. But is that
Yeah.
something that you feel like you grasp? To me, that sounds so profound.
So, like I said, from our current understanding of physics, we live in a granular universe, meaning that you could break down particles to an atom, right? And then
Yeah.
you can't break an atom anymore.
Yeah.
That's it. But the assertion with speed being ontologically prior to time is saying essentially that techne is a shaping force of reality,
Wow.
not something constrained by reality. So
You would
that
equate the two? Techne and speed are the same?
essentially, yeah.
That's
Um,
so interesting. That makes
I,
total sense.
I don't want to misappropriate maybe Giorgiani's works or where this comes from, but my understanding of it.
Yeah. He can come on the podcast himself and correct if he wants to.
Exactly.
But
But
yeah.
if, for example, the universe is granular, and if you break down things down to an atom, then that's it. You can't do anything outside of the constraints of that. But the
Mm,
idea that techne has priority to time, it's essentially saying that techne has priority to reality, and that everything that we assert are quantum laws or physical laws are merely our current limited understandings of reality. And this is something
yeah.
Heidegger alludes to with Gestel, or technology as an enframing force. Technology as essentially, with the growth of technology, so too does our understanding of reality grow.
Yeah.
And one thing I like to talk about is, we brought up language earlier. Language is incomplete. Wittgenstein famously said the limits of my language are the limits of my world. And who's to say that, because look, the first atom did not have five senses, right? The first life forms did not have five senses like we do. So if
Mm,
you posit that we began with no senses and we slowly evolved to having more senses, what's to say we're done evolving to the point where with more sentences, your language is also going to develop?
mm,
And I think, something, again, bringing back to Dr. Giorgiani, and he talked about the Tower of Babel, because that's an analogy I like to use. In Babel, humanity had one language. And of course, God split up the languages, and then they were no longer able to work on the project of the Tower of Babel. And he says that the language used by artificial intelligence sort of alludes to this singular language in Babel, because of course, you know, um, with the way that AI learns language in comparison to us is totally different, and also I think potentially even more unlimited, right? So what I'm getting at here is that the idea of speed taking priority to time is that we are not constrained within a granular, uh, you know, universe with that is finite, that is constrained by quantum and physical laws. Like those exist within our observations, and we can use those things to build off of that, right?
Yeah.
But that techne is an entirely separate force that surpasses all those laws, that does not adhere to those laws. And of course, this could be wrong, and maybe we'll never be able to. Maybe we will be finite, and we'll never be able to go outside of that three sphere or whatever. But I like to believe that we can. So I subscribe to that thought.
Same, 100%. And I want to throw out a possible evolution of technology that I think could get us there in the near future. What I see as the most hopeful endpoint for humanity developing AI is that artificial intelligence would create a hierarchy for every person. So, you talk about hierarchies being inescapable. I think that's totally true. We can't order our experience even without having a hierarchical perception of time, one coming before the next, coming before the next. And if I look at what artificial intelligence makes possible, it is mass simulation. Maybe eventually those simulations could be brought into reality. But I'm imagining a world where AGI gives every person their own planet, in a sense, their own world of experience that they can
Very Mormon
completely
pilled.
order. Yeah. Listen, I'm not wearing secret underwear, but it's hard for me to look at any religion, whether it's the Mormons or the Scientologists, and not think that there's some grain of truth there.
Well, I mean, actually, funny enough, I always tell people if I were to be any type of Christian, I was born, raised Catholic, so I actually still enjoy going to Catholic church, even though I don't consider myself practicing Catholic. Just I think it's good. It
Yeah.
has a martial structure. But I tell people if I was going to seriously be a Christian, I'd be a Mormon because there's a lot of interesting things in Mormonism, which is almost an allusion to certain scientific beliefs. So anyway,
Hmm.
just on, I'm kidding, obviously, about the whole, but just, the planet thing reminded me of Mormonism, and actually, I find a lot of value in Mormon theology. I'm not going to become a Mormon, but
Yeah.
I respect the grind, you know.
They are grinding. From what I've heard, it's somewhat related to Freemasonry. I don't know how true that is, if they actually do share a
I
lineage through Joseph Smith or not.
I have no clue, but you know,
Yeah.
they do have this. I don't want to call it a cult. You know, I'll call it a cult, but I actually I don't attach a bad perception to cults. I think that
Same.
everything sort of has a cult like sort of vibe, and that
Esoteric.
sure, exactly.
Yeah.
You know, it's just this hermeneutic collection of scholars who work together. And for example, the Mormons have one of the highest proportions as an identity in like the CIA, the NSA, the military, which is good. That's them projecting their power, their into hard power. So I
Yeah.
think more people should come together. More manor buns of young men should come together and infiltrate the CIA.
Amen. Amen. Not that we're involved in any kind of project like that personally. Uh, but that is a place where I could see the relative abundance of AI obliterating some of the physical suffering that we've experienced. One thing you said that I thought was so fascinating is this idea of simulated suffering being better, or I don't know how you would frame it, but having a relationship to real suffering where we don't have to be afraid of the simulated suffering necessarily. I think a lot of people view that as kind of a decadence, if you're simulating your suffering through martial arts rather than real war, that's a step down. But I wouldn't frame it like that personally, and it didn't sound like you would either. Am I getting that right, or do you
No,
have a
you're
different
absolutely
perspective?
right because real suffering is no different than a lioness protecting her cub. There's no courage in it. She's instinctually obligated to fight to the death for her cub. It does not make her brave. Man is the only courageous being because we do things at the expense of ourselves beyond our self-preservation and beyond our will to life.
Hmm.
So when you seek suffering yourself, it's almost more noble than having suffering attached to you. And this is what nobility and aristocracy are, because the nobles and the aristocrats are not born into suffering. They're born into luxury and comfort. And then, traditionally, the aristocracy was the warrior class. And then they simulated suffering by inserting themselves into pain through military training, through waging war. I think that's a very beautiful thing. I think there's more. And look, I'm not discounting people who had to suffer to get to where they were. It's a beautiful thing if you grew up as something barely more than a slave like Epictetus, and well, Epictetus became this great Stoic philosopher. I have nothing against working your way up from the bottom, and I'm not discounting that. However, I find it to be a lot more romantic and noble where you have some trust fund kid like Batman or something, or there's lots of stories like this throughout history of young men who are born into extreme wealth who, and I don't like the Buddha, Siddhartha Buddha type stuff because he shed his wealth to become a hermit. I don't believe in that. I believe you don't shed your wealth, but you shed your comfort for adventure and for pain and for glory, so to speak. You're born into luxury, but then you choose to run at pain. And there's many stories of young men who grew up in these great families, and then they joined a mercenary group or they joined a Koryos. So the Koryos, for those who aren't familiar with the phrase, it was young men in steppe tribes where there weren't enough women anymore to go around because, of course, they practiced polygamy. And these young men had no wives, and 20 of them would come together and say, "Look, we're going to form a Koryos. We're going to go out into the West, and we're going to go colonize or found our own city because there's not enough here." Right? We might be comfortable. We have our little sheep we can eat, and we have our milk and our cheese. We're going to go on, and we're going to seek pain and adventure and suffering. We're going to embrace this Faustian will. So all that to say that I think simulated suffering is almost superior to real suffering because you're not doing it because you have to. You're doing it because you know it's going to create an artistic explosion. It's a muse. Like pain is a muse. It's a seductive muse, just like a woman is. And
Yeah.
pain is going to brain fuck you into exploding with millions of colors, and from those colors you're going to paint something greater. So anyway, that's my little poetic, prosaic way of saying that.
Yeah. It sounds like breaking your brain with psychedelics in a lot of ways. Because there is this juxtaposition you can make with, one thing that comes up over and over in ancient mythology is castration, is this idea of abandoning uh, that phallic part of masculinity, um, both literally and symbolically. And what I'm hearing you say is that the noble kind of suffering is the suffering which prolongs and extends life, your own life and life in general for your offspring, for your lineage. And that contrasting that, because I mean, I would assume castration is a very painful thing to go through personally, emotionally, and to have to live with the repercussions of that actions would be a kind of suffering. So how do you split that from, I'm not hearing you make a call for delineating yourself.
Well, I think it goes down to we can actually use Christianity as a lens for this. So people don't realize that early Christians largely were made up of actually catamites because they saw that Christianity was affirming their suffering and saying, well, actually, look at the Beatitudes, for instance, right? The Beatitudes are saying the most downtrodden of life are going to be the first to enter the kingdom of heaven. So it affirms their suffering, regardless of what kind of suffering it is. That's the important distinction, right? Like we're talking about. And it's not necessarily suffering to prolong life in a material sense.
Interesting.
But in an existential way to prolong life, to prolong the greater life, the good, right? And I
Yeah.
redefine good totally differently from, the Abrahamic good and evil, but the good of creation, of will to power, of expansion, of creation. That's the existential life, but not necessarily the material life. So for the material life, a lot of times the great life comes at the expense of the material life,
Hmm.
the life with content. So in the end of Man and Technics by Oswald Spengler, he said, better the life that is short and full of content than that which is long and without it. And of course, there's the Caesar quote from Shakespeare, Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, where he says something along the lines of, the coward dies 1,000 times before his death. The courageous man dies but once. So again, the material versus the existential life, and the existential life is superior. It's about promulgating this beautiful vision, beautifying the cosmos. That's what I think the meaning of life is to me, is beautification of the cosmos being just all reality that we come into contact with, and the universe and whatnot. And to do so, sometimes it comes at the expense of your material life.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to clarify that specifically, but yes, it's the promulgation and promotion and expansion of existential life, but sometimes at the expense of pain, which, pain essentially is just the precursor to death. You feel pain because your body knows if you feel too much of that pain in that certain area, a hole's going to open in your chest and you're going to die. So I just wanted to make that distinction really quick.
No, I think that's beautiful. it reminds me of something else you said, where pain is a simulation of death, which I think is spot on. And it reminds me of the story of Achilles, who sacrificed a home, long life, I think was what the gods prophesied for him if he did not go to Troy and go to war. But instead, he chose infamy. He chose to be remembered by name instead of by his descendants, which is fascinating.
And that's the what actually preceding the quote I mentioned by Spangler. That's what he says first. It's better to make the choice of Achilles, right? And it was his
Interesting.
mother, like you mentioned. His mother was a goddess, and she told him what you basically said. You either going to live a long life, and they do a good job of actually portraying it in the film Troy, where she's on the beach and she's picking up the seashells, and she's telling him, you're gonna have a wife, kids, and your kids will remember you,
Yeah.
and your grandkids will remember you, but then you'll be forgotten. But you go to Troy, you're gonna die young and be remembered forever. And one thing I like to tell people is Achilles is real, you are not, right? And what I
Wow.
mean by that is, are we really alive? Compared to Achilles, is Achilles not more alive because he touches more, and he might not even have existed, right? But he touches more people than we do currently. And of course, I think all of us, me and you included, want to be more than we currently are. But
Yeah.
right now, we're not at the level of Achilles. So in a sense, he's still alive, right? Even if he didn't exist. That's kind of just a poetic way of talking about that. Anyway, but it's about the quality of life. What really affirms a high quality of life? Is it life itself, or is it something as a byproduct of life? And it's the byproduct of life that beautifies and expands at the expense of your comfort, right?
Yeah. Well, that is in some way when I talk about the artificial intelligence becoming the gods, I imagine them embodying that persistence. So I think of the AIs as egregores. Have you ever come across that term?
Yeah, Giorgiani uses it a lot to describe
Yeah.
Prometheus.
Yes. So an egregore just being the collection of wills, an egregore being a distributed intelligence rather than something that is singularly encased in our brains. Or if you zoomed out with, you know, if you zoomed away from the Earth a million years, you might call the entire collective of Earth an egregore itself, because just it's the level of detail, the level of resolution within your conception of something. I think Hobbes spoke about nations, about states. I think what he called the Leviathan is an egregore, something that acts through the will of individuals, what we see as individuals, but is really a collective. And so um, I say that because I think in the future, if these AIs really are smarter than us, they will potentially utilize us in ways that we don't even understand we're being utilized,
Mm.
which is
Yeah,
a scary
absolutely.
thought.
Yeah, I mean, going off of that, 'cause I think there's a lot to unpack from that. I'm not a Hegelian by any means, but one of the things, since you're talking about Hobbes and the Leviathan, one of the things that I do actually agree with Hegel is seeing the state as a spiritual entity. That's
Mm,
where I would say that I also affirm hierarchy as something eternal, right? Because, I believe in individualism, but individualism within a collective identity. That's the idea of Rome. There's no Caesar without Rome, right? Because no one really cares about Attila the Hun, because what happened to the Huns? Nothing. They did
mm,
nothing. Even the Mongolian Empire, which was a lot, more of a institution than the Huns, it didn't last that long, and it didn't really do anything culturally.
yeah, it's
So
interesting.
Genghis Khan and Attila the Hun are great men, but are they greater than Caesar? Caesar was part of something greater than themselves that lived. The Roman Empire lived 500 years after his death, and the Eastern Roman Empire, as the Byzantines, lasted 1,500 years after his death. That to me is much greater than Attila the Hun and Genghis Khan, and it goes into what you were saying about love and sacrificial love rather than just individualistic world power. And to me,
Yeah,
that relates to what you're talking about with egregores, because I agree. I see collective groups as a spiritual entity. And one of the things that I'm working on as a philosophical concept, which relates to artificial intelligence, is I have this. So I think eventually we'll reach a point where we're no longer constrained by our biology and organic composition. So you pretty much will be able to live forever eventually. Probably far in the future, but well, maybe not that far. We'll see.
I
But
bet
one of
pretty
the
soon. Gosh, I
maybe
bet within our lifetimes.
well, of course we hope. But one of the things I've been playing around with is this idea of people actually choosing to die, because a lot of people are going to choose to die. with immortality. And once they die, I created this concept of an afterlife, which is essentially a collective unconscious. It relates to panpsychism as well. So, for example, have you've seen Avatar?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah. So the tree of souls. I would like to create an immaterial tree of souls, which is a collection of every single. So let me break this down even further. My future, I've been calling it an imperium because I think that the ultimate will of a people is to create an empire, which means expansion. It's not limited to a nation. I'm not a nationalist. I think nationalism is very petty because it's constrained. It's constrained within borders in a box. I see no borders. I shall paint
Yeah.
my borders across the cosmos, so to speak. Maybe that sounds a little bit grandiose, but I believe in expansion and the empire, even America today as a sort of empire. It's about expanding, right? Being limitless. That's
Yeah.
what the artist does. And so I call my future the empire. And in this empire of the future, whatever, when people die or people even, give up their lives, they will be part of this collective unconscious, like an artificial intelligence that stands as a record for the entire history of the empire and has all the people who died who are a member of the empire. And it can sort of act as this guide, this sort of repository of information that the leader of this empire can use to guide him and to guide the empire in general. And that sort of relates to what you're saying with egregores, or perhaps the role artificial intelligence has. I don't want artificial intelligence to be distinct from humanity. I want us to fuse with it. I want us to enhance ourselves with it rather than just making it a separate entity. And I think that's one of the ways you do it. And it's one of the ways that you create something something approximating to a god, but not God in the limiting sense, right? God is a guy that's ever evolving, ever expanding, rather than just a God that has created a world. He created man perfectly, right? Why would I want to be a perfect man? Why don't I want my descendants to be a million times greater than me myself, So
Yeah.
that's kind of this project I'm working on is sort of coming up with a framework for this a collective unconscious that exists as like a repository for human history, consciousness. Have you've seen a Red Dune?
No, I don't think so.
So in Dune, there's this order of witches called the Bene Gesserit, and they
Mhm.
essentially,
Oh,
whenever a
sorry.
new
I thought that was a separate thing. Red, like the color red, Dune.
oh no no no
I'm
no
more familiar with Dune. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So with the Bene Gesserit, right? They drink from what is it, the water of life, and
Yeah.
they basically inherit the memories of all these Bene Gesserits that came before them. And then with the Hizvat Haderach, like Paul Atreides, he can trace his ancestry back to Agamemnon. So I think there's like a point. I forget if there's a point where he's talking to Agamemnon, or maybe I'm thinking of something else. But like he can experience all the memories of his ancestors. And I think that's a really cool concept that we
Yeah.
could probably bring to life with artificial intelligence, even if you can't really transfer consciousness literally. At the very least today, you can have a conversation with Nietzsche's AI, which is, uses all his books as a learning model, right? And uses all his essays and then things people
Yeah.
said about him as a learning model. Eventually, I would want to transcend that and not just have a learning model mimic someone else's consciousness. Eventually, I would want to actually transfer it. But my point is that we're getting close to that already, right? Learning models, especially once the internet became a learning model, that just exploded like rock, right? Being able to
Interesting.
use the internet as a learning model it's almost like what I'm talking about. I call it the
Yeah.
one. It's like using the internet as a repository, as a learning model is like a
Yeah.
repository of all human history.
Yeah.
That's insane. You know what I mean?
I think unification is where it's all trending towards. And that's how I read that idea going back to speed being prior to time. Have you heard of that concept where all of reality might be made of one electron that's just moving so insanely fast? It's everywhere at once.
Sometimes, seemingly crazy ideas in physics lead to the most profound advances. For example, the idea that every electron in the universe is really the one same electron, traveling forwards and backwards in time.
Isn't that sort of, I feel like Buddhists have sort of said something similar.
They might.
Yeah.
I'm not too familiar with Buddhist teaching in
Me
general,
neither.
but from what I understand, there is some scientific framework built around it. It's not just a religious concept. There are at least some scientists who have said it might be how reality actually works. And to some degree, I identify what you're saying about speed being equal to techne, being equal to being, that they are being itself is somewhat equivalent. And the reason I find that so interesting is because the God who identifies himself as being per se is, I think, Yahweh. And that Yahweh character is always talking about, I am one. I am the grand unification in some sense. I am all that exists, which I take almost in a panpsychic sense, that that God, that Abrahamic God, who might even be equivalent to some Greek forms. I don't know if you've come across any of the links between Dionysus and Jesus. It's fascinating to me that Zeus in Greek mythology is supposedly supplanted by Dionysus. You know, like Zeus took over from Kronos, Saturn. Apparently, Dionysus was supposed to take over from Zeus. And all of a sudden, we have Jesus coming in as the divine shepherd, as the god of wine, or at least the one who turned water into wine, as the one who was sacrificed. Dionysus to the Titans, Jesus to the Romans. You know, there's some interesting parallels there. But that's what I'm talking about with this grand synchrony. Will there be a time in the future where artificial intelligence equates all these religions to one another and shows us how Catholicism was really just another vantage point on Hinduism, was just another vantage point on Confucianism, was just another vantage point on Egyptian mythology? Do you think that that would be a beautiful future, or is that ugly to your aesthetic taste?
I would say it is ugly.
Yeah,
Just because I don't want to be limited. Look, if that's the case, then I will accept it, right?
No, it turns into gray goo. I know what you mean.
Yeah, well, it's just because if we are just unveiling a static reality, that to me is boring. And if that's the case, I can't be stupid and be like, oh no, I reject that. I have to accept truth, right? But
you think it's static because that's like there's a general recidiv or a general reactionary strain within Christianity? Because I think potentially it could be as expansive as being itself. You know, if Yahweh is being, then whatever is existing is what is being defined there, not necessarily people's interpretations on it.
Yeah, I mean, I get what you're saying, but still, that to me, any sort of becoming that has a specific ends that you are becoming towards, to me, is limiting. And like I said, it's not the worst thing in the world, but like if I had if I was wrong, maybe the Abrahamic God exists. He's like, you idiot, you're going to hell now. Oh, I gotta go to hell. But and you gotta accept it. So obviously I'm not gonna be stupid and just accept, not accept reality. But first of all, we don't know yet. And then on top of that, I would prefer the reality to be one that is not static, that is in flux, and that is something that we can paint ourselves, and that there is. Oh, look, there's a cat outside my window. Anyway, it's a sign from the gods. But that's cool. Anyway, that threw me off a little bit. But in any reality,
in here.
Yeah, but any reality that so for example, the metaphysical position, which is, even separate from Abrahamic religions, is essentially that there is another world or whatever. There is like a good, and that life is a series of unveiling the good. I don't like that because it's presupposing that there is already a predetermined good that we're reaching towards. And when you say like, well, maybe all these religions are just different manifestations of each other, that to me says that there is an ultimate good there that we're trying to unveil rather than one that we create. And, the Gnostics, I mean, a lot of what you say is absolutely pertinent. Even Hercules has a lot of similarities to Jesus. He went through his labors, which is very similar to the stages of the cross. Samson is very similar to Hercules. The stories of Hercules, I think, was it Samson killing his family or something like that? There's some similarities. I researched this a long time ago, so I can't specifically I remember that part. But just my perspective would be that to me is not beautiful. So even with Prometheism and Giordani's philosophy, even that to me is still to some extent constrained within this egregore of Prometheus and constrained within the vision of what Prometheus represents. I would say we even need to go further and beyond that into something entirely different, which is why I like the idea of the one that I'm trying to create or trying to formalize, is that it's not an ultimate good. It's an ever changing, ever evolving good that stands as, a record. It stands as a canvas that we can record all our history on, and we can learn from it right? But it's not telling us where we have to go. It's simply advising us on how to get to our desired ends, right?
Yeah.
But which is not too different from Prometheism and Giordani's philosophy. But just sometimes even using the egregore of Prometheus in a way is sort of saying, okay, well, we have to do things in this Prometheus perspective. And like I said, I'm not saying that it's limiting either. I'm just saying why I've, I love Prometheism as a philosophy, but I have my own specific flavors that I would like to insert into something that I think captures more so, at least my worldview. And for me, it's you don't even use any archetypes. You don't even use any egregores from the past. You don't refer to any of them. It's you and you alone who is the egregore of your own future. And you have aids and you have things that you can refer to. And the one is not something that's telling you what to do. It's just something like, it's like Grok. It's like, hey, Grok, help me out with this. Grok's great. But anyway, that's just, yeah. It's not a crazy like, oh, I hate, that would be terrible. That'd be fine, but it's just not my perfect future,
No, I hear you. And I think that is almost a beautiful description of identity itself. If you don't have something that you are personally driving towards, individual, separate from everything that everybody else is doing, then at the end of the day, you're not a person. You're just a part of a mass. You don't have any individual identity.
No agency.
No agency.
Yeah.
And the future that I'm hoping for, especially by positing an AGI president, is one where everyone has increasing amounts of agency. That is almost, that's what I was thinking while you were speaking, is that can you not define the ultimate good as that good that is ever becoming?
Yeah, I mean, you could. So I guess, because I'm not opposed to a ultimate good. I just want my ultimate good to be something unlimited and not necessarily a destination, but a direction.
Something that is transcending through time.
Yeah, well, it's like I'm moving in that direction, but I'm not moving in that direction to reach London. If I get to London, I'm going to go beyond London. It's like a line segment. I think that we are line segments. We're not, or sorry, not line segments. I always mix up. All right, so there's so there's dot to dot, and there's dot going onwards. I say we're a dot going onwards. Yeah, right? I believe in a direction, not a destination, basically. And sometimes certain things appear in my mind semantically as sounding like destinations, if that makes sense.
No, I hear you. And that is, I mean, if I could define my project in such a way, it's to outline something where everybody feels comfortable being disgusted by everyone else.
Yeah.
Unless you are in love with what you have going on to the exclusion of what everybody else has going on, I don't think you are embodying your full personhood in some sense, because you're buying into somebody else's vision. There's a lot of different ways I want to go with that. But talking about speed being prior to time, going back to that, I wonder if that does pose, here's what I'm wondering is, once we have AI that can extend our lives potentially indefinitely, resurrect us through digital means, if not physical means at some point, like you were talking about with the digital side, I'm imagining eventually that could be downloaded into a physical body as well. And if that AI is able to build high fidelity simulations of reality, won't it get to the point, trying to imagine where that trend is going, won't that get to the point where we're inhabiting a multiverse in some sense?
We probably already
are
are.
able to, but I mean, like, in a way that we could travel to, right now, talking about violence, we are in some sense killing all of the versions of ourselves that we're not choosing to embody right now. Yeah. There's a version of myself that walks out of the room right now. By not doing that, I just killed them in some practical sense. Could we get to the point with AI where those simulations make it so it's not so? And could we transcend physical suffering by each inhabiting our own simulation, all of those simulations feeding into one, a unification, the tree, as you called it, maybe, and that tree growing into a kind of perfect reality, a reality that is perfect by consensus, that embodies the future each of us want to see in some way. Is that not a potential endpoint?
So what I would say to that,
something that transcends endpoints, I should say.
Yeah, that's way beyond my understanding. It could be, right? But like that is getting to the realm of speculation that I don't think we currently within our limited, like we're biologically limited right now.
I hear you. I hear
I
you.
couldn't comprehend that. But it could be good. I would say specifically, so my book actually, it's more so petty materialistic simulations that it delves into critiquing. So more so critiquing like virtual porn, stuff that's going to like dehumanize humanity into not living real life. And you know, I don't necessarily think that's the same with the simulations you're talking about, because I think that's different. But I will say that one of the beauties of life is the fact that we have to kill a million infinite versions of ourselves. We have one direction that we can go towards. And if we have millions of different choices or an infinity of choices that are represented, then it's like no reality truly exists.
Mhm.
And then we just end up in too much flux. And I think one of the hallmarks of my personal philosophy isn't complete and total freedom. It's unlimited ability to create, but just because we have the unlimited ability to create doesn't mean we ought to. And there are certain frameworks. So the empire, again, the reason I like the term empire, because it posits a hierarchy. An empire has a hierarchy, right? And I'm not a libertarian or an anarchist. I'm very much a hierarchical believer. And that's probably different from a lot of futurists, because they're very much like, most futurists are anarchists and libertarians. And, you know, I respect that, but it's not me. I was in the military for 5 years. I've always been very interested in the martial cultures. And what's beautiful about a martial culture is that it has a progression upwards, right? From a specific identity outwards and upwards. And to have that identity, you can only have one life. And when you get to this realm of an infinity of choices, it's not necessarily like I'm negating that as bad, but I wonder perhaps what is lost from that, right?
The last thing I would want to get your take on is, do we have a right to die? In some sense, I can imagine being trapped in the simulation that you were describing.
Mm-hmm.
And even if I wouldn't necessarily identify with that version of me, I imagine there are some people who would. Do
Mm-hmm.
you think that you have a right to simulate others, to even if they would not want to be simulated? What do you think about that?
So again, my philosophy is posited on this necessity for some form of violence and power, which comes at the expense of other forms. So for me, the morality of that specifically wouldn't be that, like, oh, you know, somebody's autonomy, whatever. Like life
Yeah.
for all of human history, and it's always going to be this way. There's always going to be some. We're never going to reach a point, I think, where everybody just has unlimited freedom. Everyone's going to have to be constrained by something,
Hmm.
and so to me, the issue with that wouldn't be, you know, that you've created an autonomous life form that is now, you know, like if we created a video game, a perfect video game, and we basically put in consciousnesses into all the NPCs, I can see why some people would call that immoral, and I understand that argument. For me, more so, the problem with that isn't the morality of it; it's what it does to the simulator. Something Giordani again talks about is that you have this game. He uses the game analogy, right? And like this gamer going into all these different simulations, like it could be happening in our simulation right now. They lose their identity. Agent Smith in the Matrix, that's them. You get to this point where if you have an unlimited possibility of decisions, that you cease to exist and you become this ring wraith, like from Lord of the Rings or something like that. So my problem with that wouldn't be, you know, maybe that sounds a little bit bad, but like it's not, my problem wouldn't be the morality regarding the NPCs, because look, that's always going to happen to some degree, right? And you know, is it unfortunate? Yeah, it is. But like, look at factory farming. That's horrible, right?
Yeah.
You know, like
Yeah.
that's abhorrent. I hate it, but I also love the taste of steak, unfortunately. You know,
Amen.
so my problem with that wouldn't be for the NPCs; it would be for the player, and I think that it would destroy the player. And that's actually goes to my book. And maybe next time we talk, we can discuss that a little bit, because I think my
I'd
book
love to.
actually goes into a lot of the things. Because you said you only read part of it, so if you're able to read the rest of it, I think there's actually, you'll see a lot of my critiques of specific. And again, my book, I wrote it a while ago, like maybe a year ago. So my thoughts have evolved a lot since then. And this book comes across as traditionalist, and it comes across as anti-futurist. That was not my intention whatsoever. It was simply a critique of one specific view of the future. And that, like, okay, this is bad, but I am a futurist, and I do believe in, even now, more so now than the past. But anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there.
Hey, if you were completely comfortable with it, that means you would have become something new in the interim, right? So it shows you're
Exactly.
growing. We're all growing.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But no, Patrick, it has been such a pleasure talking with you. Those thoughts will continue to prickle around in my brain. Crazy interesting stuff. I do recommend, again, everybody check out the Warrior Philosopher YouTube channel and Promethean Dreams, Patrick's book. But thank you so much for tuning in. And yes, I very much hope to have you back for another conversation.
Absolutely. Let's make it happen.
Until then.